Hey now, and welcome to episode 42 of the Help Find the Others podcast. If you've been here all along, welcome back. But if this is your first time listening to us, well, welcome. I'm your host, Ruben. And as always, Stan is on the line. How you doing tonight, dude?
Doing great, man.
Awesome. So, so this episode was Adam, and he reached out to me and wanted to kind of, come on the podcast, but also talk about a documentary that he produced and has put online. And I got to admit, ahead of time, I feel bad, but I didn't actually watch it before we recorded this episode. But I think it still ended up being a good talk, though, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the topic, to let everybody know, is just the religion and the psychedelic ties of the Abrahamic religions. And the documentary was 4 hours and 20 minutes. So you and I both didn't have time couldn't find time at least to check it out fully. But the conversation went great, and I learned a whole load of perspective that I'd never thought I'd think of. Growing up Catholic, I guess that was the only interpretation of the Bible and religious texts that I could think of and heard of. But hearing his spin on it all was definitely mind-opening.
Yeah. I think, even without being able to dive into the topics in his movie that much in this episode, I think we really had some good talks. And so I hope you guys enjoy this episode with Adam.
I have one question for you guys, though, before we jump into everything.
Mm-hmm.
So your show is called Help Find the Others, right?
Yeah.
So I thought that was a cool name because Terrence McKenna always went on about, find the others. He was always just, that was one of his kind of big calls to action, was just, to find community and to reach out to other people. I thought that was cool. That I think your name's kind of neat. So I was just curious if you were drawing from Terrence when you created the show.
I mean, absolutely. That's the first place I heard it, but he was quoting Timothy Leary, actually.
Oh, is that true? Yeah. Okay.
Was it him or Alan Watts?
No, it was Timothy Leary.
Oh, okay.
They were both in the kind of same cultural milieu, I guess. They were.
Yeah, I mean, that might have been kind of like a slogan of that era of like psychedelic thinkers. I'm not sure.
Yeah, you might be right. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm pretty sure like the quote that I looked up for like the first episode of our podcast was, I'm pretty sure that was Timothy Leary, and I think that's who Terrence was channeling there.
Right. Okay. Gotcha. Yeah. I do use some quotes from Timothy Leary in my documentary and some clips from him. He's an interesting guy. He's a real interesting guy. I guess I can just tell people a little bit about the documentary that I made that we're kind of here to talk about. So I made this documentary titled "The Psychedelic Origins of the Abrahamic Faiths," and in this documentary, I show how the early forms of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are very kind of in alignment with the 1960s counterculture. And I try and use some clips to creatively kind of splice together clips from the 1960s into like these biblical movies that I've kind of borrowed a bunch of clips from to show there's a kind of similarity of culture. And I actually use some scriptural references too, and I talk about what is actually written in the Bible too, and about the accounts of what they say happened. So it's a kind of reconstructive effort to try and reconstruct what the Bible might have been talking about. And according to my view on this, is I think that there is a lot of involvement of psychedelic drugs and really a kind of psychedelic culture being prominent in these early religions. So that's my documentary. I do have a YouTube channel, but I'm trying to reformat it right now. So I don't know. I need to find a way to kind of brand it and do it right. So
yeah. So you know, your ideas that I saw in your videos and like the trailer for your doc and stuff like that. Um, I mean, and we were just talking about Terrence McKenna and like it, his stoned ape theory. Um, that's kind of like what it feeds into. Like after uh,
Yes,
we
yes.
evolved, from species that we became spiritual, we became religious because of the psychedelic mushrooms. Like, did that spark your interest, or did you come across this idea like prior to that, and then that just kind of falls into the same thinking of the stoned ape theory?
It's so I was kind of born and raised in a Christian kind of environment, I guess, and so I didn't really know much about the psychedelic stuff until I got into my high school years, and I went to an art school, so there was plenty of uh, hippie types floating around, and
Nice.
and yeah, for sure. So, but that's kind of when I discovered Terrence, and then somewhere along the line, I was reading the Bible too, and kind of trying to get something out of it, and I found a few things that just struck me as being very kind of psychedelic in nature, and then eventually, what I really kind of started to see was that Terence McKenna's kind of stoned ape culture that he talks about. He talks about the kind of mushroom cattle goddess religion of the of primitive humanity, essentially in the Saharan grasslands, and that uh, what I found out was that this religion seemed to continue into ancient Egypt, and then from there into the Abrahamic religions, because we know Moses, according to the scriptures, was really a part of Egypt, and the Israelites left Egypt, and they seem to have borrowed some of this kind of cattle worship seemed to be a part of it, and we see that with on Mount Sinai when they construct the golden calf. It's kind of there's a lot of interesting parallels, and there's a lot of ways you can approach it. But I don't know. It's hard to kind of go through chronologically. So that's kind of why I made the documentary to really just kind of put all of the pieces in order so that people could see kind of how this tradition emerged from the Saharan grasslands and then into these traditions, and like what the symbolism in these religions says about the kind of origin of this culture. So
Yeah. No, I mean I agree with it. I agree with Terrence's kind of ideas of how it like started, but it's like
right,
then it's like, okay, well, we know that these substances were only made illegal like 50 years ago or whatever. So like
right, right,
from when we became human as a species to 50 years ago, like why would we not think that psychedelics weren't a huge part of spirituality of humans, and
right,
and since the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are can be traced back thousands of years. Well, then obviously psychedelic culture has been entwined with those religions that whole time, except when American like Puritanism came along.
right, right. And that's the interesting thing about this is like it kind of destabilizes a lot of the religious fundamentalist kind of arguments that we hear from people about Puritanism, because I mean the fundamentals seem to be a psychedelic culture.
Yeah.
That's the funny thing about this, is that it totally upends all of the religious arguments that people use to kind of argue for this kind of authoritarianism. You know, yeah, because if these were psychedelic cultures, and it kind of looks like they were, then they had a very kind of distributed way of dealing with things. And there's all kinds of like anecdotes, for example, in Moses' story, Moses sets up this government, and he has this whole system of delegation where everybody is kind of making these decisions on his behalf, and really he's trying to remove himself from deciding everything for everyone else. So it's a very interesting kind of decentralized paradigm of government that emerges out of these psychedelic religions, particularly in the case of Moses, but it seems to be also emergent in the case of Jesus and with Muhammad too. Although, it's a funny thing to be looking at these religions because they are often there is a lot of contention about interpretation with these religions. So it's hard to have these conversations sometimes because you don't want to step on too many toes. And but I think there's something really valuable to be gleaned from this when you can kind of see that there's a kind of unity of symbolism between these religions. It starts to put it all into context, and you can kind of see that there's a kind of kernel of this psychedelic, very free-spirited culture that was prominent within the early forms of these religions. It seems that these things do get lost though over time, that somehow the psychedelic use falls out of practice in one way or another.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I suppose, it really, I don't know. If you want to start with the chronology of the Abrahamic religions, I suppose what you could talk about is, because psychedelics in and of themselves are really kind of hard to talk about. Unless you're talking about like the chemical structure or kind of some of these new kind of modern experiments that are going on with these drugs. Really, they're really challenging to talk about because the experiences themselves are very unique and very novel for each person. But when it comes to history, and you're talking about people that you suspect may have taken these drugs, you can kind of extrapolate and elaborate on what these drugs might mean by kind of understanding their thought and understanding the way that they did things. And you can kind of get pieces of that out of the Bible, out of these religious texts that talk about different like ways of managing a society, different rules, different customs. And you can kind of, if you approach it with a kind of open mind, you can kind of extrapolate a few interesting points. And the more you realize that these were psychedelic movements, the more you see that these religions were really not very authoritarian. They were very kind of collective consensus traditions, more or less, and they were tribal traditions. It's very interesting. Yeah. But did either of you guys get a chance to watch any pieces of it? I'm just curious.
I just saw the like where you were talking about it and showing like the trailer, I guess, from it.
Right.
Yeah, but I wasn't. I hadn't had time yet to watch it. But
it is a long watch. I made it 4 hours and 20 minutes, so it does take a while to get through it. But there are some pretty specific references. I can get into some of them if you want, but it might be a little bit. It is a little bit geeky and a little bit nerdy, but there are some really interesting references if you want me to dig into some of them here.
Yeah, man, I'd love to. Yeah.
All right, cool. So, for me, one of the first things that really like showed me that like it gave me like a really big holy shit moment was when I was reading through. I was just dry reading through the Old Testament. I just said, I'm going to try and read through this, understand it. Obviously the first run through it, you pick up on a few things here and there. But I got to the book of Proverbs, which is written supposedly by King Solomon. The book is called the Proverbs of Solomon in Hebrew. And King Solomon is supposed to have lived around 1000 BC, which is estimated about 500 years after Moses. These are estimations. It's kind of old history. It's hard to reconstruct. But so Solomon writes in the book of Proverbs, the verse is chapter 20, verse 30. And Solomon writes, "The blueness of a wound cleanseth away evil. So do stripes the inward parts of the belly." It's a very cryptic verse. And that translation is a King James Version translation. So again, the verse is the blueness of a wound. And as we know, as people who've taken psilocybin mushrooms bruise blue. And then he says, so do stripes the inward parts of the belly. And this makes sense to me as a description of a mushroom, as
Yeah.
the psilocybin mushroom.
Yeah.
And this is King Solomon, one of the revered figures of the ancient Israelite tradition. Supposedly, King Solomon had the greatest extent of the Israelite empire, 1000 BC.
Yeah.
And he, built this extravagant temple, and he represents the height of the Israelite kingdom, really. And so he's revered, and he's held in high regard by Jews, by Christians, and by Muslims alike. So the fact that he wrote this verse, supposedly, it's really, I mean, that was my holy shit moment when I found that verse, because I hadn't seen anybody talk about this. So that was when there's some stuff to find in the Bible that isn't being talked about. And what's interesting about that too is that if you open up, for example, the New International Version of the Bible, and you look at that verse, the translation will not be the same. The translation will say something like, beatings and blows cleanse away evil, so do lashes on the belly. So it's a completely different interpretation of the verse that gives a very kind of disciplinarian, father figure with the belt kind of interpretation of the scripture. That is very different than if you read it in the King James Version, where it seems like he's describing a mushroom. So it's very interesting. It's a very interesting, and you can see there how things get lost in translation, and these religions get kind of perverted into this very domineering, egoistic kind of mentality. And I think Terence was right to kind of deride this in his lectures and in his books.
Yeah.
This kind of religiosity,
Yeah. Well, and I mean, you said it there though, that so much is lost in translation. That it's been translated from how many different languages with how many different kings, right? And
Yes,
maybe that's a fragment that was left out after a larger part was edited that talked more about and plainly said it was a mushroom, or whatever that he was talking about in that passage, where
yes,
that could have been edited out, but they left the thing about bruising blue because they're like, oh, they could think that's something else, and that's
exactly.
that's the interesting thing to think about scripture is it's a 5,000-year-old game of telephone.
Right. It is. It's a 5,000-year-old game of telephone. That's perfect. That's perfectly put. Yeah, because you're really trying. I mean, it's like trying to get blood out of a stone. It's just because it's very dense, and you have to really kind of look at everything, and you have to look at it in context, and it's a challenge to really try and get some kind of historical information out of these books, because they're
Yeah.
very mythological, and yeah. But it seems that there are some very interesting arguments, some that I've even come across that since I've made my documentary. So, I thought I'd kind of found a lot of the big pieces, but I recently watched another documentary. Really, actually, it was just yesterday. I just found this documentary with a gentleman named Simcha. I can't think of his last name. It's Jacobovinci something. He's got a really complicated Jewish last name that I can't pronounce properly. But his first name's Simcha, and he did this documentary on the Exodus, and he really tried to make this kind of scientific argument for the miracles and the Old Testament. It's very good. It's a very good documentary. If you just look up Simcha, Exodus, Moses, you'll probably find it. But anyways, he kind of goes through this kind of practical explanation of how these miracles happened in the Old Testament with Moses, and basically he draws this line of connection to this event called the Minoan eruption, which happened about 1500 BC, and this was a volcano that exploded in the Mediterranean Sea and basically turned the sky to ash, and he does all this analysis where he kind of shows that this kind of eruption would have caused a lot of the effects that we see described in Egypt happening at the time of Moses. So it's very interesting. And they obviously interpret it as, the signs of the gods and the wrath of Moses' God on Egypt and the Pharaoh.
Like the
But
plagues or whatever.
yes, exactly. And the plagues kind of stem out of this. But he really he really pulls it out in a very interesting way. So I'd suggest anybody watch that. But so there's a lot of people who are doing some interesting work to reconstruct what's happened with the Old Testament and this kind of ancient piece of our history. Uh, and it's I think it's very interesting to consider the Old Testament and this early part of our history as history. I mean, I think a lot of people discount this stuff as being a fantasy, but when you look at the actual Old Testament, it's filled with lots of geographical places and the names of specific people, and there's a lot of historical information in there. It's a little hard to just write it off entirely as a mythological work, because I mean, it'd be hard for somebody to make up a story like that with all these place names and names of people and events.
Yeah.
So it seems a little bit inconceivable that these books would be entirely made up. It seems that there has to be some kind of parallel to history, and that makes it very interesting and very valuable, I think, too, for just understanding the past. And I think Terrence's Stoned Ape theory is great, and I think it's awesome that he was able to kind of reconstruct this idea of how human evolution might have happened, and it seems very plausible to me. But then kind of considering that this tradition kind of extended itself out into the world religions today is also very interesting, because it's a way for us to kind of connect back to that kind of archaic way of life through some form of the traditions that we're left with,
Yeah.
But they might have to be reinterpreted to a certain extent.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and I'm sure, in making this documentary, because of the clips you use and stuff, like you've seen probably more speeches and talks from these people than I have. But I think I remember hearing Terrence like kind of expanding on the Stoned Ape theory to where he was talking about why, religions started to ban psychedelic substances, was that after generations and generations of like our spirituality coming from the magic of psychedelic plants, that eventually the cults gave way to religion, and that the religious figures realized that if we can restrict, everybody's having the magic, everybody's getting the message, that if we can restrict their usage of it, and we sell them the magic, like they're going to listen to us tell them the magic, and we can manipulate them that way through the stories of the magic, and that and so they were trying to restrict everyone from experiencing like the truth, I guess,
Sure. I think that's definitely a plausible scenario, that, you'd have these kind of leadership and caste structures kind of emerge out of these primitive groups. I definitely think that's definitely within the realm of possibility. But, I think people are naturally curious though too, and that I think it'd be hard, just as it is today with the current, drug policy, to hide this stuff, or really to outlaw this stuff. It's hard to really put the lid on it. People figure it out, and either through word of mouth or whatever, people, if you look for it, really, you figure it out.
Yeah.
That this stuff is kind of important culturally. But I think you're right. It was kind of secret. It was kind of made secret and put within these occult traditions, and only the initiated could really understand it, or at least it was tried. There was probably some attempt to control it for sure. And I think Terrence also goes on and says too that the kind of climate conditions in Africa probably led to some of the decline of mushrooms being available.
Yeah.
And so that would have made it just available really in the Nile Valley, maybe some places in the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. But that would have kind of reduced the availability somewhat. And so that probably would have played a role too in in just the kind of maybe the lessening of the tradition within a general population.
Yeah.
As it were. So, but
So now,
yeah, go ahead.
So, and you mentioned it there, the Fertile Crescent, and I heard you talking about it in one of your videos.
Right.
And that's where all of these religions started and everything. Why? So why is that? Why do you think that kind of, the three religions that run the world today all started in one little area there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I have a full answer to it, but I think that the best answer I can give is that, if Terence is right, and a lot of modern academics are right about human evolution happening really in the Sahara and in Africa, then it stands to reason that, once the Sahara started to dry up, you'd have these migrations of people out either, across the Mediterranean or out eastward into the Fertile Crescent, into the Middle East. So you'd have these kind of refugee populations, kind of spreading outward as the Sahara was drying up to find, more fertile land and places to settle. So that could have definitely contributed to it. There's, and Egypt is kind of maybe the first place of refuge for these people, leaving this drying climate, where things were still fertile, and you could grow crops, and you could have a civilization. You could have groups of people cooperating together and working together. So I think that's probably a big part of it is, if the evolution story, as we've been told, is straight and it's right, then it makes sense that these people would kind of migrate out that way and really start civilization out there.
Yeah.
And but something that's interesting too is this whole notion of the Garden of Eden in the Bible. That there's this idea that man is somehow fallen. We used to live in this paradisical world, and then man has fallen and was judged by God and was banished from paradise. And Terence references this in one of his talks, and he says, that this whole myth and the fact that in the book of Genesis you have an angel standing guard over paradise with a flaming sword. Terence is saying this is a memory of the drying of the Sahara. The angel with the flaming sword is the sun just scorching off the savannas where people used to live, basically without any need, because you'd have cattle grazing everywhere. You just go hunt whenever you wanted to eat, and you had these mushrooms growing everywhere out of their poop, and it was a paradise world, where everybody had enough space. I mean, Africa is a huge continent, so it's an interesting idea, and that after the drying of the Sahara, then people had to start practicing agriculture to make the most out of the land, and you started fighting for resources, and things like that started to happen. But so that whole transformation of this nomadic pastoral culture into an agrarian civilized culture is a kind of maybe is present in the book of Genesis, in the Garden of Eden story. But it's hard to say, it's a lot of interpretation and kind of art history going on there.
Yeah.
But yeah,
so I know, and like with the Garden of Eden, I mean, to mention, psychedelics again in scripture, like the
right.
Eve taking a bite and, getting the knowledge, the tree of knowledge or whatever.
Yes.
I mean, that sounds like a psychedelic reference to me, and it all, it kind of always has.
Yeah,
honestly.
I agree. Yeah, a lot of people talk about that reference too. I think Jordan Peterson has even brought it up in some of his lectures, and so some other kind of popular people who talk about psychedelics have brought this up. Yeah, it definitely seems like, you eat something and you get knowledge. I mean, it sounds like a drug.
Right,
really,
yeah.
It sounds like a drug. So, yeah, so it's interesting. Have you heard of the manna reference in the Old Testament?
So that was when they were wandering around the desert after, or
Yes.
was that before the Ten Commandments or after that? I can't remember.
It it's shortly afterwards. It's
Yeah.
shortly afterwards. Yeah. So that's an interesting piece of scripture. It's very because it's very descriptive, and all the descriptions seem to fit what we kind of know about psilocybin mushrooms. I've heard other theories that it was maybe, the manna was ergot, which is, kind of another kind of fungal outgrowth that happens on grain. And some people speculate that ergot, excuse me, that ergot was used in the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece. But I don't think it's ergot, and there's a few different reasons for that. But basically, what you have is with the ancient Israelites, once they leave Egypt in the Exodus, Moses and this group of people are essentially wandering around. And what's interesting about the biblical verse is that the place where they're wandering, when you look at the Hebrew translation, it actually says wilderness. So they're not wandering in a desert. Some of the translations say that they're wandering in a desert because today that region is very arid. But what the text says is that they were wandering in a wilderness. And the word that they use is midbar. And this word, it it, it, it means a place where cattle go to graze. It's unoccupied land. It's a place where you can send your cattle out to go eat grass, and a place that's not really owned by anybody. So it's wilderness. Yeah. So it's very interesting that they use this word to describe where they were wandering, because it means that where they were was kind of fertile. There was things growing there, and there's also references to birds coming down in the mornings, and they would hunt these birds and they'd eat these birds, and then they'd also eat excuse me, I'm sorry, they'd also eat the manna as well as the birds. So you have this kind of fertile territory where Moses and the Israelites are wandering, according to these accounts. And another thing that's very interesting is that they said that a presence that a fog would come and descend upon their camp, and that this fog possessed the presence of the Lord. Now, this is interesting because this is setting up all the conditions that are necessary for growing mushrooms.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It's real interesting. So if you have this nomadic population of people who have just left civilization, essentially, and you have these people wandering around with their cattle, and their cattle are pooping everywhere, and then you have this fog coming down into this kind of fertile territory, and it's kind of warm because it's the Middle East. You have all the conditions that are necessary for growing mushrooms. And and then it goes a step further, and it describes this magical food that comes from nowhere. They don't know where it comes from. Everyone's just perplexed by it. And they say that it grows on the ground like hoarfrost. Okay, and if you look at the networks of psilocybin mycelium, it grows and spreads like frost. It looks like frost. And so the fact that this magic food that grows like frost appears in this cloud, and they have their livestock with them, there's so many alignments of symbols that it seems very plausible that they were taking hallucinogenic mushrooms.
Yeah, that's crazy. I've never heard that. That's
yeah, it's really interesting. And the language that they use to describe this stuff it's really interesting. And they even start complaining about this food actually too, which is very interesting. The Israelites start complaining to Moses. They're saying, why have you brought us out of Egypt to eat this food? We want to go back to eating the leeks and the onions and the melons and all these kind of normal food substances. And they're complaining. They don't like eating these drugs. Something's happening where they don't like this. And what happens is, in the scripture, it says that the fire of the Lord came and burnt throughout the camp. Okay, this is what the verse says. My interpretation of this is that they were eating so many of these drugs that they essentially went into a state of mass hysteria, where things started getting very slippery, and they couldn't communicate, they couldn't have understanding, and there was a kind of chaos in their camp from these drugs. really a kind of mass psychosis, I think, that emerged out of these people taking these drugs. And so they go to Moses and they start complaining about this food that's making them crazy. So it's a kind of, I think it kind of works as an interpretation, because if you take too much of this stuff, it can really drive you over the edge. So a lot of us know who take mushrooms that you kind of got to space it out. You don't want to take them all at the same time. You know what I mean? Right.
Well, and I mean, you got to think about it too, that like no one knew what, like, if a large community of people all ate something as powerful as psilocybin mushrooms, and it was the only food they found that day, so they gorged themselves on it, and you don't know what it is, so everybody just is hit with this fucking wave that, like,
Exactly.
People that want it to happen end up not being able to handle it. Like, can you imagine being blindsided by that wave, And so I could definitely see that leading to something that would, be considered mass hysteria.
Yeah, right. It's just an interesting kind of thing to think about. It seems, because I mean, I think, I don't want to disparage these drugs in any way, or say anything bad about them. But I mean, you do have to take a kind of a certain level of moderation. I mean, even like the microdosers, they're not taking 5 grams every day. They know you got to take like a little bit, because these are intense experiences. So yeah, you could imagine that if this was a kind of primary food source for these people, and they were eating them just to survive, you could get up there into some pretty wild experiences. So so that's kind of interesting. And another thing that really struck me pretty recently was the fact that the Israelites refer to the place that's called Canaan. I call it Canaan sometimes, but scholars call it Canaan. It's the land of Israel today, and some really into Egypt and into Jordan and into a few other places in the Middle East. But that they call this land, they call it the land of milk and honey, right? That's what we hear, that term a lot when we look at these scriptures. And I think that this might actually be a reference to psilocybin mushrooms. The land of milk and honey is the land where mushrooms grow. And the reason I think this is because if you just look at a mushroom, it's growing on this white stalk, and it has this cap that's kind of gold colored, and it's got this geometry underneath it. It's got these kind of striped straight lines, and it's a bizarre looking food if you're somebody who doesn't know what it is. And I think that this was an occult reference to these mushrooms, that milk and honey actually means psilocybin mushrooms, and the land of milk and honey is the land of God, because that's where the mushrooms grow. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, it's really interesting. And the fact too that Israel is very fertile because it's close to the Mediterranean. It gets a lot of fog from the Mediterranean Ocean. It makes it a good place for these mushrooms just to kind of pop up and grow, because you got to keep in mind too that these people couldn't grow these things. They didn't know how to grow them. So finding them was like a magical experience. It was like a good omen. So the land of milk and honey and all that, it's right. So not being able to cultivate this made this kind of into a very kind of a mystery tradition,
Yeah. Well, I mean, and when because you couldn't cultivate them, like you said, when you ended up in an area, you ended up sticking around there, which probably is the Fertile Crescent is involved there, that maybe that's why all these religions started up there, because as the grasslands receded and became desert, the cows were probably the first ones that were like, we're going to keep following this grass, and so the mushrooms went with them, and they were headed towards the Fertile Crescent because that's where the grass was, and the humans were just following them because they're eating the mushrooms that grow out of their poop, so like that's, I guess that makes sense in my mind there,
For sure. And the whole nomadic culture too, that was a big way that people kind of stored their wealth, was in those animals that they, that was where they got their meat, and they could make tools out of the bones of these animals. That was where their wealth was. It was in their flocks. And even in a lot of these places today, that that's a big source of wealth for people, is taking care of these pastoral animals. So
Yeah.
that's still kind of a tradition. So
Yeah.
yeah, and it's interesting too in the case of Moses, is in the Israelites, they would actually pick up their tents, apparently, and it says this in the Old Testament. They'd pick up their tents and they'd follow this fog around wherever it went, and that's kind of what they did when they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. They were just following this fog. So wherever there was fog, they would just set up camp there because they knew mushrooms would grow.
Oh, that's crazy.
Isn't that really interesting?
Yeah.
It makes sense as a kind of, when you look at it anthropologically like this, and you try and understand, what their migration patterns were and all that. When you try and look at it from a scientific lens, it starts to kind of come into view.
Yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Huh. So I know, like, I've heard people talk about the burning bush is supposed to be some sort of psychedelic event, right?
Right. That's it. Yeah, that's an interesting one too. Yeah, so Joe Rogan talks about this a bit on his show. You guys watch Joe Rogan?
Yeah, I do.
Oh yeah,
for sure. So, yeah, so he brings this up a bit, and he brings up some scholarship about some scholars who think that this might have been the acacia bush, or the acacia bush, which is rich in DMT. I have a different interpretation of it. It's not too much of a difference, but essentially, I think Moses was already high on mushrooms when he had that encounter, and there's a couple reasons. The first reason is that the burning bush. When Moses comes across the burning bush, he said the scripture says that the bush was consumed by flame, but was not consumed by it, essentially. So he sees that it's on fire, but it's actually not burning. So it's not being consumed. So he's having a hallucination, I think, is what the scripture really says. The bush was burning, but was not consumed by the flame. So it's like a hallucination. So he's already tripping, I think. And what's interesting about this is that location where he is when he has that experience, the place is called Midian. It's a territory that belongs to a different branch of Abraham's children. And in that place, that's exactly the same place where Moses and the Israelites were wandering during their exile that would happen later in the story. So Moses has this hallucinogenic encounter with this bush where he sees God come to him, and while he's doing this, he is tending a flock of sheep for his father-in-law. So, he's tending sheep. He has this hallucinogenic encounter. I mean, really, if you just put the mushrooms in the poop of these sheep, then you have this scenario where he's eating these mushrooms and he has a hallucinogenic encounter, and he describes this hallucination as the burning bush. And it's interesting when you kind of geographically locate it according to what it says in the biblical narrative, because the Israelites come back to this exact same place and they find manna. That's where they find the manna. It's in the same location. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And I mean, and I've heard that too, that it, people say it's the acacia tree, but I agree with you that it sounds more like a mushroom trip, because
Yes.
the acacia tree, you can't just eat any part of it or something like that and have a DMT experience. Like,
Right.
even if it was referring to ayahuasca, like that needs a combination of two plants. Like, it's not orally active.
Right.
And I think any psychedelic plants that were being used by people at the time of the actual people that are in the stories in the Old Testament, it would be orally active, like fruits or nuts or whatever. Like, they didn't have the chemistry yet, even ayahuasca is newer than the Old Testament, I guess is what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And there's a guy, really interesting dude by the name of Kalindi E. Have you heard of him?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So he talks about mushrooms as kind of being the kind of first hallucinogen, and it's kind of complete in and of itself. You don't have to mix it with anything. You just pick it and you eat it.
Yeah.
You don't have to do anything. There's no technology involved. You don't need, pots to boil it in. So it's very primitive in that way.
Yeah,
It's easy to
you
access.
didn't need fire. Yeah, you didn't even need fire.
Yes, exactly. So it's easy to access, and I think even, even if you just burned a bush out in open air, I don't see you being able to get like a serious DMT high. You might get like a little bit of like a changa buzz or something, but
yeah,
really to go into that full blown hallucinogenic encounter, it seems more likely that he'd kind of be already hallucinating. I think.
Yeah.
Or
even or I've heard too people say they think that the burning bush was like the sun was setting behind a bush and he was high or drunk or something like that, or whatever, and like it looked like it was on fire or whatever, but it's like, no, this dude talked to God, he was tripping.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And it's really interesting. And even the content of what God says is interesting in that, according to Moses and according to scriptures, what is said by the burning bush to Moses. You have, this is where the promise to deliver Moses and the Israelites to the land of milk and honey comes from this encounter. Yeah. And it uses this language, I will bring you to a land of milk and honey. And it's very interesting, and it's also has this very kind of liberatory message that's very interesting, because it's a recognition of the slavery of the Israelites in Egypt, which, based on what we kind of the basic stuff that we understand about these ancient civilizations, is that they used debt slavery to enslave these populations. You always owed something to the state. You had quotas to fulfill for your labor, to give the state something. And that's the way that slavery was enforced. It was through taxes. So just this whole idea of this kind of enslaved population being freed by this kind of psychedelic personality, it's something that's so interesting to me as a story, and you can obviously extrapolate this to like modern times, and like, because it seems that we have a very similar problem in modern times, that we have a kind of situation where we have lots of people enslaved by debt and by these institutions, really, maybe not intentionally, but it's just a process of just these institutions maybe outgrowing themselves.
Yeah.
And you have, seeing this kind of psychedelic story as this kind of story of liberation, it's very, I think, inspiring, and just I think it's interesting.
I honestly don't think it's the institutions outgrowing themselves. I think it's the people outgrowing the institutions is what's going on, though.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think that's why religion is having a really hard time. Other than religion that is like kind of changing, like churches or synagogues or mosques that are like kind of modern and hip or whatever, but like old school, sticking to the scripture, religion is having a really hard time because, people are like, I don't know. I've seen some YouTube videos and I think maybe this is bullshit, like, and that doesn't mean people are becoming less spiritual. And honestly, like my work with like talking to people in the psychedelic community, like there's some people that are spiritual as hell that don't believe in religion at all, and,
right. For sure.
And so like, I think kind of that's what's going on with the Abrahamic religions now. And honestly, if like I was saying that some, churches and stuff are being progressive, it's like, I think there's some credence to having, I know there are some psychedelic churches that follow, Judeo-Christian, like kind of, culture. Like,
right.
I can't think of the church, but I think the biggest like legal ayahuasca church in the United States is like a Christian based organization, I believe.
Right. I think you're right about that. I think that the Native American church, as it's formed, I think is a kind of Christian in essence, and a lot of even just South American shamanic religious organizations kind of have syncretically adopted psychedelics into the Christian ideas and the messages of Jesus, really. So there is a kind of there's some overlap there, it seems, where these things kind of lend themselves to kind of cooperating and working together.
Mm-hmm.
When you're just looking at the stuff that Jesus said, and maybe not so much of the stuff that some crazy folks rattle on about, but there seems to be a kind of an awakening of some kind happening with the culture, where people are really willing to question a little bit more than they have been, and I think that's great. I think it's a good thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm definitely in that same cultural milieu, I guess, but I don't know.
Yeah, like I feel that psychedelics, much like they started evolution from ape to human, like
Yeah.
we're still they're still evolving with us, and we're still evolving with them. um
Yeah.
I often think, like, because I agree with you that, like, if you're talking way back, biblical times, that probably the psychedelic in that region at that time, the only one that they were on was mushrooms, and I think for a
Right.
long part of early humanity, at least in that region of the world, that's what influenced us. Not just influenced their religion and influenced that scripture, like that's just what influenced humans. Even before they started saying, "Hey, we got to start writing this shit down." Remember when dude walked
Right.
across the water? Like,
Right.
So, like, but as humanity has evolved past the biblical times into times that are structured in religion and stuff like that, I think that's where the other drugs came along, like, and that's all part of the evolution. Like, we evolved to the point to where we could have the mushrooms tell us, like, hey, if you boil these two plants together and make this tea, like, you can talk to God, like, once we got
Right.
that chemistry, and then once we moved to smoking that DMT, like, and then moved on to eventually getting the chemistry available to make LSD. Like, I think that's all part of the evolution of psychedelics with humans. And there's been, it's
Yeah,
almost like
definitely.
religion is a byproduct of it, but then also a main, like, hindrance in its, like, kind of attachment to us. I don't know.
Yeah. It's a complicated thing to look at. It's funny. I kind of touch on this in my documentary a little bit, but yeah, I think I agree with you that I think that the evolutionary process hasn't stopped, really. That these psychedelics are still perpetuating our evolution in some way, I think. And I think that, I mean, what's really interesting is if you look at, let's say, just Greece during the time of the Eleusinian Mysteries. Greece was kind of the wellspring of culture and civilization, especially for the Western world. And the fact that we recognize Greece as being this very advanced society, and that they were taking these drugs, it seems that these drugs seem to kind of accompany these kinds of advancements in civilization, in thinking, and even in science, in mathematics, because you have, Pythagoras is one figure who is famous for the Pythagorean theorem, but he was involved in all of these crazy mystery schools where he was probably taking drugs. I mean, the Dionysian mystery school was one of them, but there were lots of them in ancient Greece. And this idea that what we see, or what I seem to be stumbling upon recently, is that when you look at where these psychedelic drugs traditions are where they are, there seems to be a kind of following of scientific advancement or some kind of social or civilizational advancement. And I think religions in their early forms, they were really very advanced. And even Moses's tradition, this organization of these nomadic tribes, this was an advancement for the Israelites. This was, they got their sovereignty back. They were able to organize themselves and to govern themselves. This was a huge leap for this particular group of people. And I think when people do integrate these psychedelics into their diet, what you end up with is a situation where you can be making these advancements where you're, because you're thinking, you're reflecting, you're trying to understand your environment, you're trying to participate in your environment. It brings about a more thoughtful, I think, approach to life as a whole. And I think that, it does lend itself to some level of kind of even scientific advancement. And Silicon Valley is another very interesting example of this too. You have all these microdosers out in Silicon Valley building these technologies and kind of, continuing this kind of progression forward. You can. It's interesting. It's an interesting pattern, I think, if you think about it that way, and it kind of validates what Terence said about these drugs facilitating the evolution of the human brain. And if you think of language as a technology, it kind of fits into this idea that psychedelics might be a kind of an important part of the human story in general and the advancement of our thinking and how we organize things. I think that I think that we're missing a big part of religion when we only think about it in terms of ideas, or when we only think about it in terms of prescriptive, things that you have to do. I think you should, if you really want to understand religion, you should try and understand what these people went through, what they experienced, and try in some way to kind of match it or mirror it, or you don't have to live like these people did, but try in some way to empathize and think through their shoes.
Yeah. Well, and even just like we've mentioned a couple of times, like understanding the historical climate change that happened and how that would influence all the life, like the flora and the fauna across an entire continent, like we're talking about,
Right.
And so like it totally makes sense what you're saying, that like you have to like kind of look at the whole picture and not just, that's one of the things I hate about like how so much war is caused because of like these three Abrahamic faiths fighting over the details, like the wording of the same book, and
exactly that's exactly. I definitely empathize with you on that. Because it seems like really these are very similar traditions at their root, and it's not really that much to fight about. It's just once you get obsessed about things, maybe that you don't really need to get obsessed about, that you can start to end up with problems. So that's kind of why I'm really interested in trying to help kind of propagate a kind of more psychedelic view of these religions, because I think there's lots of potential for kind of conflict de-escalation between these people, and even between religious folks and non-religious folks too. There's kind of I think there's a very understandable middle ground. But it's
well, I've always kind of half joked that, like, with all the missiles and drones that we fucking blow up over little warring areas of the Middle East, to this day, did we ever even think of like dropping like some sort of bomb that would like mist LSD over them, and like, what is that worse than blowing them up? Like, let's just try that and be like, whoa, nope, that was terrible, and then blow them up. I don't know, but,
right.
But it's like,
Right.
Can we try the weaponized LSD first? It wouldn't take that much.
They might have tried it actually in Vietnam. I don't know if this is true, but Terrence told this story about when he was in Berkeley. I guess a bunch of college kids stole this barrel of like liquid DMT or something. I don't know exactly what it was, but I think that's how he described it. But he said it was some of the best stuff he's ever had. I don't know. I can't even remember where I heard that. But.
Well, I mean, around that time, like the military was definitely involved in researching what they could about LSD, and like very secretively and very kind of recklessly too. Like,
Right.
And have you ever seen it's called Wormwood. It's like a kind of mini series on Netflix, but it's about like the whole CIA and military, like researching LSD on people, ended up with like killing a dude and making it look like it was a suicide.
Right.
That he jumped out a window, and like it's a whole thing about that. But I could see that during Vietnam, they were like, hey, let's drop some LSD and DMT and whatever on these dudes and see what happens, because like we're researching it and we've got a perfect chance here to use this as a weapon on an enemy and see what happens.
Right.
And it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, I think that my guess is that whatever results they might have achieved from doing something like that is, these are very hard things to control. I mean, because you give these psychedelics to one person, you get completely different results than if you give it to somebody else. So it's very hard to say what the end result is going to be when you give this drug to somebody, and so it's not something you can really control. And I think that for that reason, I think the United States government really kind of got its hands out of the whole drug thing, at least publicly. But yeah, but it's a good point though. Like if we could find a way just to like evangelize this or something, to get this into the kind of some realm of public acceptability, it might it might be helpful and beneficial to some people. But I mean, you got to also be honest too about the risks and about the health concerns related with some of them. Psilocybin's pretty safe, and I think LSD is pretty safe too. But there's some, in some cases you gotta, like with ayahuasca, you gotta watch your diet, and so you definitely you do have to have you always have to have that level of caution, and people have to do their own research, and
yeah, we always like our channel is definitely all about like safety and moderation, like you've mentioned.
Right.
I mean, I find it interesting, like Kalindi Ai, who you mentioned, like he talking about taking 30-40 grams of mushrooms is crazy to think about, but it's like that's not something I see myself ever doing, and it's definitely not something that I would recommend to people. But
yeah, you don't jump in that deep. You definitely don't jump in that deep for sure.
Yeah,
that's something you got to work your way up to. He's at legendary status with that for sure.
I mean, that's a calling at that point. Like
right,
that's as much as anything else that they call for like a calling to like clergy almost. Like it's like that's a devotion to that fucking life, because you're never going to be the same too. So
right.
like yeah, I find all that interesting, and like that's one thing, like too, like we were talking about with the manna, that like when that fog came down and there was a real bumper crop, and like that was the only thing that they had to eat that day, and they all gorged on it, like they probably had like 30 grams of mushroom, or the equivalent,
right.
or whatever.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
That would be a fucking insane experience, that like a whole community of people that had that experience at the same time. That would be far out.
Yeah, exactly.
and
exactly, man. Yeah,
no wonder some crazy shit and 10 commandments that still
right.
exist to this day came out of that. That's a big fucking ripple in space-time.
Exactly, man. Exactly. Well put. That is so funny. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It's real interesting to kind of look at the historical context too, because I don't know, it's cool. But Another thing too that I always like to give a caveat to is that I'm actually personally I haven't taken these mushrooms in quite some time, but I think it's a good idea to argue for legalization or at least decriminalization at the very least, and
Yeah.
and I really actually wouldn't even encourage anybody to take these mushrooms until that there's some kind of decriminalization status, because the legal penalties of taking them are very steep unless you're associated with a religious organization that has clearance to take them. It's really it's pretty steep, and it's a hard thing to do when you don't have you don't want to be paranoid going into it either, and so you shouldn't go out of your way to look for it, or as Stamets says, he says, I don't provide, nature does, right? So,
Right.
if you if you come across it in nature and you feel okay about it, then think about it. But I wouldn't really, I'm definitely in favor of having these experiences. I think they're good, but I wouldn't say that it maybe. I think definitely exercise caution and recognize that the political circumstances as they stand today are just are not very friendly towards this stuff. So you have to be aware of that.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
for sure. I mean, I will say though that while the whole way that drugs are scheduled in the United States needs to be changed, but I will say that like now since weed is legal everywhere pretty much, like mushrooms kind of like seem to have like slid in the back door. Like you can't buy
yeah,
them at stores. Like
right, right,
the tax man isn't involved, but like I don't know. You could buy all of the stuff to grow them that like the DEA should know, like, hey, this guy bought this and this and this and this. Okay, so he's growing mushrooms, but like they obviously don't care. There's a couple states that do, I guess, as far as that goes with growing them. But it's also seems to be like what in Denver, okay, for instance, they
right.
they had decriminalized mushrooms or whatever. But then like I can't remember what podcast I heard this on, and I might not have the number right, but I'm pretty close, I would say, is that in the last 10 years, there was only 4 arrests for mushrooms anyway in Denver. Like it
No
was,
kidding. Yeah,
yeah, like it was like, it's awesome. It's a great bill. It's a great movement forward. But at least in that city, it was a solution to a problem that didn't exist. That like
right, right.
4 people in 10 years got arrested for mushrooms. Who cares? You know, um, but that being said, it's like a watershed moment for the policy for drug policy, at least for plants in the
Definitely.
United States.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, definitely. And it's good to see these things, kind of being brought into the light, and there are these decriminalization movements really starting to gain some traction because people are recognizing that these plants have extraordinary medicinal value at the very least, um, for treatment of PTSD and all these things. So that's good that this is happening. You know, I think that, but I think really these things should be kind of available regardless of like whether or not you have a condition. There should, I think, be some kind of decriminalization framework where maybe we have some kind of rule against driving with them or something, but
mm-hmm.
because that's just dangerous and irresponsible to be under the influence of these things while you're driving. No reason for that. And I've known people who have taken this stuff and driven, and it's just I don't I don't see any reason for that. If you're going to take these drugs, you should do it in a kind of religious setting where you're devoting your time and your attention to this. You're not worrying about the details of driving or whatever. So, but yeah, I think there's a way to kind of use the Native American strategy that has been used for peyote, um, and apply this to mushrooms within the context of the Abrahamic religions. Because when you look at the Abrahamic religions, you see that there's this evidence that these mushrooms were very sacred to these early groups. And, there's a rational legal argument that you can make to say, the Native Americans can take peyote because that's a part of their religious tradition. When it comes to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, we didn't touch too much on Christianity and Islam yet, or maybe we might not have time for it, but it's also present there too. And when it comes to these religions, this is very important to these religions too. So I think that there should be a space open for the followers of these religions to have some kind of church-like organization where they can take these drugs in safe places. And so that's a big thing that I think could be talked about a little bit more. It's another path to legalization, and it's perhaps some people would perhaps disagree with it, using a religious model for legalization, because as we know, Timothy Leary attempted to do something similar with LSD. The problem with LSD is that it's a kind of it's a lab-made chemical, really, that is fairly recent, and it doesn't have a lot of religious history. So Timothy Leary created the League for Spiritual Discovery and basically tried to make these assertions that he wants to use LSD within this organization for spiritual purposes. And the government basically kind of wrote him off like he's kind of crazy. And a lot of people kind of blame Timothy Leary for discrediting the psychedelic drug movement because of this, because he was trying to go for legalization under a religious model. But if you see what he did, and then you see that, basically 30 years later or so, the Native Americans did it, but they succeeded because they were appealing to their indigenous culture and heritage. I think if you do a similar thing with the Abrahamic religions, you have a much greater chance of success than with this kind of, just let's say we took MDMA and said we started our own church. It's a little bit, it's a little bit on shaky grounds because you can't really show anything in the Bible that says MDMA was a part of, these traditions.
Yeah. And I don't know. I know you said that you mentioned Timothy Leary, or you had some quotes or whatever in your movie.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if in your research, if you ran across it, a lot of the psychedelic revolutionaries, that have all went on to become their own, authors and gurus and speakers and stuff like that. They all point to Timothy Leary kind of screwing the pooch for the whole movement for a while because of that court battle to try to make it a religious thing, and that they hated him, and then that just kind of screwed it all up until the Native Americans were able to get. I think it wasn't until Bill Clinton, right? I think that there was the
Yep.
Yeah. So that was a long time that he kind of sent it all down, where they were at the verge of being able to make it legal, but he took it this religious aspect that they were very insulted by at that time. Basically is what I read in some books, is that they were our politicians were in our country was very, very Christian at the time, and they were very offended that you're you take this drug and have a different religion, so
right. Well, so yeah, I definitely kind of see the kind of where they're coming from with that criticism, that criticism of Timothy Leary. But at the same time, Timothy Leary was really kind of there from the beginning with his work at the Harvard Medical School. He knew that this stuff wasn't going to get legalized under a medicinal act. He could tell which way the wind was blowing beforehand. You know what I mean? He knew what was going on, and so he saw this as a way to kind of, to make sure that this was something that was freely available to everyone. And so his strategy didn't work for him, but it did work for the Native Americans. And I think, this strategy, I think, is very, it's brilliant. I think it's brilliant. It's a way to kind of bypass, what you can call the orthodox authorities. But, when you look at the original texts of the Judeo-Christian and Islamic traditions, you find that, these were very 1960s cultures and movements. and they were using psychedelic drugs. And so this opens up a new path, to say, you can make all kinds of different arguments about this. You can approach Christians and you can show them some of these references and talk about Moses in the context of this nomadic culture that was eating mushrooms, and you'll probably blow their mind. And I mean, really, but it makes a lot of sense. It puts the history into context when you look at it this way, and it vindicates Terence McKenna. And so it puts a lot of pieces together once you just kind of put the Israelite tradition into that context. And then you can also see how it gets passed on to Christianity and onto Islam. That's a little bit more complex theologically. There's a lot of different scriptures you have to follow in order to see how it goes there. But I think I do a pretty good job of it in the documentary. But there's a continuing tradition is really kind of the crux of it. Is you had the early Israelite tradition, and can you guys hear me? Okay, cool. I just had to reconnect. So you had the early Israelite tradition, and then they had this whole priesthood that preserved the manna by the Ark of the Covenant, and then you have all of these descendants, and you have all of these lists of these different lineages. And then you have John the Baptist, who's Jesus's friend, and John the Baptist traces his lineage back to Aaron, who was the high priest during the time of Moses. So, and there's this scripture in the Old Testament that says that Aaron, the high priest of the Israelites, was to preserve the manna next to the Ark of the Covenant, right? He's given this command to do this for his generations. So basically, this was like a monarchy established within the Israelite clans, essentially. And Aaron's descendants were in charge of basically maintaining the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle, which was this big tent that stored all of their sacred objects. And along with that, he was to maintain a pot filled with manna. And it's very interesting. And it's Aaron and his descendants. It's Aaron and his generations are to preserve this manna. And I think this means, they were to always keep a fresh pot of mushrooms inside the tabernacle next to the Ark of the Covenant, so that the high priest would always be able to eat these mushrooms and communicate with their God. It's very interesting. And especially when you tie that to John the Baptist, where Jesus kind of goes to get baptized, there's a very interesting thing that ties into the Dead Sea Scrolls here that's very interesting. I don't know how much time you guys have, so I don't want to be too long. So you can tell me if you want to keep going with the story a little bit, or we can...
Yeah. Well, I mean, we probably got another 20 minutes or so. I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'll try and wrap it up pretty quick. But essentially, what ends up happening is you have this mushroom tradition kind of get passed on through Aaron's descendants, through Aaron's sons, until it reaches John the Baptist. And John the Baptist is a really interesting character for a lot of different reasons, but one really interesting thing about him is that he performs this baptism ritual at the Sea of Galilee with Jesus. And this ritual was prominent in a couple different places. It was prominent amongst the Essene community, the people of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which for some of you who are listening, you may know John Allegro, who wrote The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross.
Yeah.
He claims that Jesus was a mushroom in this book. I have some disagreements with him, but he was a philologist who analyzed the Dead Sea Scroll texts, and he basically said that all of Christianity was a mushroom cult. So the fact that John the Baptist and the Essenes are practicing this baptism ritual, and aside from that, there's also an Egyptian group that is practicing this baptism ritual in the banks of the Nile. And this is a very interesting thing, because anyone who's ever cultivated mushrooms knows that there's a process when you're cultivating mushrooms where, after you pick the mushrooms off the mycelium, you dunk the mycelium into water for something like 24 or 48 hours. And you let the mycelium rehydrate itself. And then when you pull the mycelium out of the water, it will start to grow new mushrooms. What I think John the Baptist is doing when he's baptizing Jesus, I think this is a mushroom growing ritual that was kind of put into this ritual that was kind of quasi religious, and there's a few reasons for it. One, they were doing it in Egypt, on the banks of the Nile. So this may have been an Egyptian tradition. It could have been a tradition passed on from his ancestors going back to the time of Moses. But really, as we discussed earlier, these primitive people didn't know how to grow mushrooms from spores. So anything they could do to increase their yield, would have been beneficial to them if this was their sacrament and if they were using this stuff. So once they figured out that you have to rehydrate these mushroom cakes by dunking them underwater, this would have been a kind of really important discovery that would have allowed them to like double or sometimes triple their supply of mushrooms just from one cake. You know what I mean? So yeah, so the baptism ritual seen within that context is kind of interesting to think.
I've never thought of that. That is pretty interesting.
Yeah, to think of it as a mushroom cultivating ritual, it makes a little bit of sense. And the Essenes who were the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and if you ever read some of that literature, it's very esoteric. It's very visionary. It reads like the Book of Revelations. There's visions and apocalyptic battles and all that stuff. So it's quite interesting. Another group that's really interesting related to John the Baptist is the Mandaeans. And the Mandaeans are famous for prohibiting seedless foods from the diet of their general population. And this is a way of saying you can't eat mushrooms in the Mandaean religion. And I don't know, it's a bizarre dietary prescription that you don't really see anywhere else. But it seems to me that the Mandaean... Oh, go ahead.
No, did you say that it was seedless fruits? Is that what you said?
Yes, seedless, without seeds.
Oh, okay. So
without
the fruits of the mycelium, and it doesn't have seeds. Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, it was because they could not see. They couldn't see the mushroom spores. They didn't know how these things propagated themselves. Whereas with grain, you see the seed, you can plant it in the ground, and it will grow a stalk, and you have another grain plant. With mushrooms, it seemed like it was magic, or they didn't know how it propagated itself. So that's what they mean. But it also means meat. It's a vegetarian prescription too. Some people think, at least. So that's interesting that they prohibited mushrooms, because this may have been a priestly prohibition to keep this taboo and to keep control of this mushroom eating within a priesthood. So, and the Mandaeans have very esoteric literature, very esoteric. It's some of the most dense stuff. It's almost impossible to read through, really. So that's very interesting. John seems to have these connections to these really far out groups, and he's performing this strange ritual. And there's a reference in the Dead Sea Scrolls, or actually it's a reference by a commentator. It's a reference by a commentator to a gospel that is lost. We don't have the actual record of it anymore, but we have these commentaries that are referring to this gospel. And in this gospel that they are referring to, it basically says that John ate manna in the wilderness. That's basically what it says. John the Baptist. They said that his food was like a cake dipped in oil, and it tasted like manna. So they basically tell us in so many words that John ate manna, and it's called the Gospel of the Ebionites. And this is really an extinct Christian group that was very different than really any form of Christianity that we have today. They kind of revere Jesus, but at the same time, they kind of see him as kind of like a failed prophet in some way, but they also respect John the Baptist. So they're this very strange in between group, but they were called by some scholars Judeo-Christians. They kind of really mixed the old Israelite tradition with some of Jesus's sayings and the stuff that happened in the New Testament, according to Christianity. So they're this very interesting in-between group. And they seem to have some connections to the Dead Sea Scroll community. But also more so than that, this group, known as the Ebionites, there's a monk that comes from this group about 600 years later who is a teacher for Muhammad. And this is actually a priest from this Ebionite group is the first person to say to Muhammad that he is a prophet. And this happens when Muhammad's very young, between the ages of 8 and 12 years old. So you see this continuity. John the Baptist inherits this tradition from Moses, passes to Jesus too, and then then John's tradition passes on to the Mandaeans and to the Dead Sea Scroll community and to the Ebionites, and then the Ebionites take this and they pass it on to Muhammad. So you have this chain of continuity going all the way back to at least ancient Egypt, and perhaps before that to the Saharan paradise culture that Terence was talking about. And it's this extraordinary continuity of this mushroom culture going all the way back through history. It's very, very interesting once you start seeing that there's a reasonable chain through which this stuff could be passed down generation to generation. Yeah. So it's super far out, and you might need to watch the documentary really to get some of the details, because I'm kind of plowing through it pretty quick. So.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I definitely, I apologize for not having time to watch it before we talk, but honestly, like, after I watch it, I'll probably have you back on to have more questions about it and stuff.
For sure,
like,
yeah.
I mean, it's super interesting. Like and I understand that it's hard for you to just talk about it and try to cram it in a little podcast or whatever, but it's I think it's a very interesting way to look at history and to take I mean, I think there's a lot of religion that gets taken as history that it's like, that's not actually the way it happened. Like that's what, like, people take it, like we were talking about war or whatever, like disagreements over, like, this is what gets you to go to hell, like you shouldn't do this,
right.
or whatever, like
right.
that kind of like steadfast, like it says in this book, that's what it's supposed to be,
right.
like I think to look at it as, it's like, no, this was all like how our environment and the time like shaped what we are now and what we believe and what our morals are and stuff like that.
Yes.
And so it is history, but it's also not history. It just,
right.
We didn't happen. It didn't happen the way it's written in the book, because they didn't understand what the fuck happened, because they were on mushrooms, or whatever.
Right. Right. It was, it was a very creative endeavor. It was, it was very free-spirited. So, if we want to be like what these religions were, we kind of have to be like that today. So that opens up a whole, like, lots of new avenues of possibility for the future. And I think that's the exciting thing about it. Is a little bit, it's a little maybe nitpicky to kind of go through the details of this and try and reconstruct this history, but the reward is really that, if you can find a way to make sense of it, and you can show that there seems to be a kind of connection between these psychedelic cultures, it opens up the door for lots of new kind of creative thinking about the possibilities for the future. And that's I think that's the really important takeaway. But
yeah, no, I agree. I think that's a great reason to have made this documentary and everything, and get the message out there that you're doing. I think I totally agree with it, and feel its importance as well, man.
For sure, man. Well, and I'm also open to criticism too. I think that criticism is also very important, and that's another reason why I kind of want to publicize it a little bit, because I do want to see, if people can poke holes in any different parts of what I'm doing, because, that's a good thing. It helps to get a greater sense of, what's going on with the history. But I think that this kind of long form continuity, it kind of brings everything into a kind of a holistic sense. It's not like one religion here, one religion there. When you see this kind of undercurrent of similarity between these traditions, it makes this history much easier to understand, makes it a lot easier to grasp, and it it shows a very different side of these traditions that I think I think it wouldn't hurt us to try and look at these things in this way. And I think Terrence would be pretty interested by this stuff if he were here today to hang out with us and have these conversations. I'm sure that this would be something that interested him.
Oh yeah. Well,
you know,
I think I'm grateful as I'm building a psychedelic community myself. Like, I am so grateful that I live at a time where, like, Terrence is no longer here, but like, because of YouTube and videos and whatever.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. We get to hear him.
He's eternal now,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
And it's like, how many of these people that were characters in the Bible were those kind of people? But the thing is, like, the only thing that down the road humanity could remember about him is like this one book that everyone keeps, changing
Right.
and translating or whatever.
Right.
But
yeah.
like, so it's great that Terrence, whether he's right about his ideas or not, just his way of thinking, is able to influence generation after generation after generation,
Yeah.
From here on out. And, you're out, with the direction you think and what you've done with your documentary, it's obviously rippled into you, and you're sending out those ripples, and it's rippled into Stan and I. And,
right.
And so it's, I honestly, on this podcast, we don't talk about Terrence McKenna enough, but I think most of the people listening to this podcast are probably here in part because of Terrence McKenna. So,
for sure. Yeah.
So,
I mean, he definitely, he left a big impact on, I think, everyone who's interested in psychedelics, and even in any kind of futurism, and in kind of understanding the future of just American culture and society, really, because he was a big cultural influence on so many people, and he kind of really kickstarted, I think, the imagination about like what a future might look like that isn't totally dystopic and corporatized. You know what I'm saying? He really kind of offered a different vision of the future that I think is great. To have an egalitarian, open society. His whole, I mean, I can't say enough good things about Terrence. It's just he was really kind of one of the first guys I really stumbled upon that really got me thinking about this stuff in new ways. So, definitely grateful to him, and and to the listeners too. The documentary is 4 hours and 20 minutes. It's a little bit long, and this is my first documentary I've ever made, and I do my best to make it presentable. Try to watch the HD version if you can. Hopefully, I can give you guys some links or something.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, we'll link anything you want, man, in the video. So,
okay, cool. Yeah. So, and so I'm not perfect, and my editing skills are maybe a little bit choppy at points. So, try and bear with it if you can. There's some interesting stuff though in there. So that and I touched on a few interesting points, but there's quite a few interesting things about these stories that don't really get talked about very much. So, I just want to thank you guys too for having me on. Just to chat, and it's been great.
Yeah, no, it's great. Thanks for reaching out, and like I said, I feel bad I didn't watch the movie, but once I do and I have some questions, man, we'll have you back on.
Sure, yeah, and like I said, if you disagree with a few things here and there, I'm definitely open to those discussions too. So definitely, don't be shy. If you want to talk about it, I'm all game for it. So
cool, man.
All right, cool. Well, it's been great.
As always, thank you for listening to the Help Find the Others podcast. Please don't forget to check out our Discord server to connect with our growing community. The link to join can be found in the description. And if you feel like donating to our channel to help us grow, a link to our Patreon can also be found in the description, as well as some cryptocurrency wallet addresses. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast or have any questions about these topics, please email helpfindtheothers@protonmail.com. If you would like to leave a voicemail or a text message question for a future episode, Stan, what's that number again?
567-233-1335.
Okay, guys, thanks again. And until next time, let's help find the others.